LUAN Emotional Podcast, conversations for inspiration on the go. We offer on-the-go inspiration because our whole heart is set on beauty and our best bets are set on art. Hi, Fabian. How are you today? Welcome to LUAN Podcast.
Hi, Marion. So nice to be with you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for joining us. Today, I have this special person, a dear friend of mine, Fabian Pfortmüller, and he's a Swiss community builder that lives in Amsterdam. Fabian co-founded the Together Institute. This is a not-for-profit organization dedicated to building, caring, engaging, and healthy relationships in communities, networks, neighborhoods, organizations, and society at large. Fabian is also the co-author of the Comunity Canvas. This is an amazing thing that I love for people to go and check it out, because this Community Canvas is an open source framework to support community builders across the globe. And Fabian is an innovator in residence for the Kaufman Foundation. In the past, Fabian co-founded Sandbox, which is how we know each other. This is a global community of young changemakers with 1,200 active members in more than 40 hubs around the world. And together with Dave Radvapar and Mike Radvapar, Fabian co-founded Horsey. This is an organization providing tools for a meaningful life. The organization's manifesto, the Horsey Manifesto, and I would love to talk about this too because I love this manifesto, has been shared over 120 million times online and was described by the Washington Post as the new just do it thing. I love this. He's a frequent speaker at events and organizations around the world on the topic of building communities, authentic brand, values-driven organizations, and social entrepreneurship. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts in London and has been recognized as top 99 under 33 foreign policy leaders by the Diplomatic Courier in 2011. Wow, Fabian, what an impressive resume. And I want to ask you, what's the purpose and the benefits of impact networks? What have you seen around the world in your career about community building and why we need them?
Yeah, I think, we're in a funny time where I think we're becoming more and more aware that we have these big, I think the time right now has never been as good as now and never been as bad as now, Mm-hmm. And I think what's happening is that we have these really big issues and challenges like climate change or poverty or inequality, where there is not a clear solution that will fit it. Mm-hmm. It's highly complex, it's systemic. And how do you go about solving something that is complex? I think networks and communities are a very clear and practical way actually of approaching very complex issues, because complex issues in the end of the day are connected from one thing to the other. They're relationships, they're relational. And I think one way to do it is by bringing those people who are working on all dimensions of these challenges to bring together and bring them into relationships with each other. And that's why I get very excited about that. And that sometimes these issues can be very big, climate change, or they can be very small, like what happens with our street? Mm-hmm. What makes the street better? And I think if there's one thread that goes through my work and what I believe in is that in the end of the day, whatever I look at in life, I see relationships. And the same thing with these big challenges that we see out there right now. I don't know what that brings up for you, Marion.
Yes, I think that eventually we need to understand about the power of the collective, right, instead of the individual, in the sense that, realizing that every single action that we're making every day has an impact in the collective. That could be for something good or for something bad, right? And that's why we focus a lot in LUAN in the ethical decision making, because every day we're making decisions, right? And each decision that we make is impacting in a good way or in a bad way or in a neutral way to the community that we're living in. Meaning it could be our company, it could be, our close friend circle, our family, it could be our country, it could be our planet, right? And, something that, I find fascinating, it's about, for example, a mycelium in trees. That's a perfect example about the power of community and how important it is to having, communities that thrive. Because as you mentioned, everything is about relationships and the connection that we're making with one another, not only with ourselves, but with one another. And I'm a firm believer, especially through the experience, for example, in Sandbox, right, about the people that you meet and the impact that people are having in your life, and probably maybe you don't even know the impact that you're having in other people's lives, right? Mm-hmm. So we're constantly having this butterfly effect with every person that we're meeting and every person that we're being with, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the way I think about this is also on the level almost of story of how we look at the world. And I think this kind of language for me is inspired by this American author called Charles Eisenstein. And but it's really also very present in indigenous cultures across the world, which is that there's two ways of looking at the world. Our current world looks at the world as everything is separated. I am separate from you. I'm separate from the people outside. I'm separate from this tree out here. Everything is kind of separate. In the end, we're all these atoms in our cells, and there's space between us, there's separation. And if that story is true, then you have to fight really hard to make as much for yourself, Mm-hmm. There's another story, which is that everything is actually already totally connected with everything. Mm-hmm. I'm actually not that separate from you. My energy and your energy right now something will affect each other, the same actually with the tree outside, the same with our family, the same with our neighbors, the same with people who are very far away from us. There is a relationship. We're actually already in relationship with each other. The question is, what kind of relationship is it? And I believe in that second story. I believe that everything actually is already connected, that everything is connected to everything. But the question is, what kind of relationship is it? And in many cases right now, these relationships are not healthy. They're not just, they're not right. And I think part of the question that I think is really interesting in this time right now is to ask, what makes this relationship to each other, to the tree, to the people around it, a healthy relationship? Because it is a relationship no matter what. And that's for me kind of almost on the level of story, a perspective that shifts. And the thing you bring up is what we've seen in our own lives and experiences is that when you start believing in that story and when you start investing into that story, it's amazing of the abundance that comes from that, right? The generosity you can experience from that. And while in the individual story, I feel like I have to fight for myself. I have to become as wealthy as possible. It's a hard life and you have to fight to survive. In the other story, there is so much. There's so much that people have. And I think that's the story I choose to believe. And also a story I want to make possible and make more a reality and make a healthier reality, because I think then a lot of these challenges we have right now, even climate change, is a story of not the right relationship we have, right? Or inequality and whatnot. I don't know what that brings up for you.
Totally. And what you just mentioned about this feeling of separateness just reminded me of Erich Fromm, in his book, The Art of Loving, that he says that, we're born with this sense of feeling separated from everybody else, especially, even though we're born, well, some of us could be born inside, a family or some of us could be born, without a family. And that feeling of separatedness, of being separated from the other exists, just by the reality that we have right now. And what Erich Fromm says is that by loving, the art of loving, the benefit of it is that eventually you feel that that separateness, that distance that we have between one another actually merges and ceases to exist. And that's why, we can experience fraternal love or couples love or parental love or siblings love or, and different kinds of love by activating, through love, this kind of connection between one and another person, eliminating that barrier that we think we have, right? And I think that sometimes when we're in community, right, what gets activated is some kind of emotions, right? It could be in sometimes, loving emotions, right? In others, as you say, like unjust emotions. But in, by living in tribe and community in a village, we're having, these emotions that at some point makes us feel more connected.
Yeah. And as you say, with both the good and the bad. I mean, I think also like relationships, as we experience every day, maybe with our romantic partners or with whatever, or with family, is that the bad is just, conflicts, whatever. These things are actually part of relationships too. But it's a skill, it's a muscle to learn also how to work with them. We work as romantic couples, we learn as romantic couples to, have healthy conflicts. But as society, or as, do we learn this as neighbors? Do we learn this as society? I think that's also kind of when the not so great emotions are actually super important and super productive.
Totally. And I want to ask you, Fabian, what is the main difference between communities and networks? How can you differentiate both?
Yeah, for me, the main difference is one in the quality of relationships. For me, everything is a network. Everything is a network, where network just means things are connected for me, but it doesn't necessarily say how deep is something connected. A community is a very particular type of network, which, these are my words, this is not the definition, but this is how I think about it, is that community is a network that has a level of trust, where there is deeper relationship. There's a sense of belonging, like we are in this together, these are my people, where there's a sense of care, where there's maybe a sense of values and principles in there. And often when there is the relationships are more dense, they're more kind of closely connected than just in a network. So really it's a community is a network, but I think it's a more a stronger kind of network, a more trusting network, a more caring network. And while a network can be anything,
Does the size matter? Kind of like in the sense that communities tend to be smaller and networks tend to be bigger, or not necessarily?
Yeah, I think so. I do think so. Actually, the longer I do community work, the more I think that size matters a lot, and that I think, for example, in the example of Sandbox, there are these like local hubs, and then there's like the region, and then there's maybe the global, and the same exists in nature, which is fractals, right? Like you have a fractal and then you zoom out or you zoom in. And in this way, size can go quite big, but it has to almost like have a small unit at the moment, at the center of it. And what I mean by that is that my intuition tells me that if you're part of a community where you don't feel real connectivity, maybe intimacy, real connection, real like trust to someone, it's not really going to be a community. And I think if you're in a group of 1,000 people or 2,000 people, that's very hard to feel.
Yeah.
But if you're in a group of 20 people, that's very easy to feel.
Yeah.
And so I think to build a community of 5,000 people is very hard, but to build a community that has 30 groups of 20 people each, that is very possible. So I do think there's limitations in size. And, the other thing is that one thing we have to consider is that many of us are part of not just one community, but of many communities at the same time. And so I think that limits actually you probably heard of this Dunbar number of like you can have like connect relationships with 150 people at a time. And then people say, oh, we should make communities of 150 people. But that assumes those are all of your relationships.
Yes.
But really, you're like in 20 communities. Some of them you're at the center and some of them you're at the periphery. So I think the number in most communities, in my opinion, are too big in order to be healthy.
What would be the ideal size of a community in your personal experience?
Yeah, again, I think it has to be the fractal thing. I think that communities start with 5 people, they start with 10 people. I don't really know like what the top number is, but I know that when you start, that you start with a table. I always think like the community starts with like who fits around the table. And that's the people you can really be in conversation with, you can build friendship with, you can build connection with, and then it can grow. Then like you can like bring more people in. I think whenever the moment the group becomes more than like 100 people, you need to start to have like different subgroups, because it's just very hard to be in relationship with a lot of people at the same time. And organization being so more heavy, like you notice, like as someone who organizes community, like organizing for 20, 30 people is quite easy. Organizing for 100 people, all of a sudden you need to like have a special venue, you need to have a reservation, it becomes more expensive. These things really matter. And I think organizing for like 10, 20 people is just cheap, easy, simple. And so it becomes easy to replicate. I think for me, it's more about things like that. So like practicalities, which also size really matters.
Totally. And what you mentioned about, fractal growth, no, it's funny how we are constantly in contact with nature, and this term biomimicry, right? That we get, information design, architecture, that comes from nature. And the fractal growth, no, we've seen it with the Fibonacci seashell, no, kind of, or like the oral proportion as well, about how the trees grow, how the bees reproduce, right? It's always kind of like the sum of the last number. So if you have 1 and 0, it's 1, then 2 and 1 are 3, 3 and 2 are 5, 5 and 3 are 8, and so on, right? It continues repeating until then you have this exponential growth. And it seems that we're still having those math inside our communities or inside the relationships that we're having, which that is fascinating.
Yeah, I think what you're describing is what good community could be. I also experience actually a little bit different, that a lot of, I think in this, especially in the last century, and still in this century as well, I think our main mindset is not natural. Our main mindset is mechanical, is engineering. And I think that has also been really deeply influencing the way we think about communities to some extent as well. Sometimes when I explain to people, what do you do for work? I do community work. They assume I work with Facebook, or I work, with like social networks, because the association with community right now is actually very often technical. And I think the engineering mindset is actually really unhealthy for communities. It assumes, for example, that communities can be planned. It assumed that, you can just like, there's a blueprint where you exactly do these things, and then like that's kind of like that's how you get like the community machine. Also scale, the idea of scale is also a very mechanical engineering form when it's not fractal based. And I 100% agree with you that I think nature is the best teacher when it comes to community. I also feel that we have so much still to learn there from nature, where we're only starting right now. We have so much like, I give you an example, like how we're trying to bring like nature into our community work. For example, nature works in cycles. Everything is cyclical in nature. It starts, it grows, it nourishes, and then it decays and it dies, and it cycles back again. Most communities right now, they don't want to go through a cycle of growth and death. They want to. That's also a mechanical thing. It has to always be on. It has to always be nourished. And it also has to like linearly grow, right? It's not, nature does this. Nature does not do this. That's kind of the mechanical mindset. For example, that's something that I think about a lot. Like, how do you bring cyclicalness into how we do this? Because nature does it. It's just a little example.
And how do you manage this cyclical movements inside communities? Kind of like, would you propose in kind of like, we need to let the community decay and then kind of like plant the new seeds again, and then make it grow, and then make it nourish, and then kind of like reproduce itself and then decay again, right? Yeah. And I think that eventually that would give you a stronger community, or that could help, that could, make people kind of like, fade away a little bit, whichever decay. Because if you have the mechanical mindset, eventually you might not feel related of these kind of like death and reborn of these new cycles.
Yeah, it's a beautiful question. My sense is your intuition is spot on. Like the way, for example, we think about cyclical is that everything is cyclical in a community, and it goes from the individual to the subgroups to the big group, where they all go through moments of strong activity to low activity. On the individual level, right now, like 10 years ago, you were super active in Sandbox and you were like hosting things and organizing things so much. And then came another phase where you became more like maybe a participant in it, and you became more like someone who would not organize but go. And then now you're in, now you're outside of Mexico City and like you can't really go to an event. So you actually rather like on the outside of it. Like that's very normal as that individuals go through the cyclical, but they also, maybe in like 5 years, it will be really interesting for you again, and you'll be like up in the thing, right? First of all, so individuals have the cyclical, but now think about it, like the whole group has the cycle too. Like, okay, the hub when I was in New York, the New York City hub, when I was there was like a lot of things going on. And then afterwards it was like not so active, and it came active again. And then like it was like super inactive for a while. And what I realized is that there's two ways to think about that. One is frustration and fighting it, and one is acceptance. And I used to fight it. I used to think like, oh my God, no, the Mexico City hub, now Marion is like leaving or something. It's going to like, there's not much going to happen. And it's going to go into like a moment of like pause and decay, right? Of winter. It's going to go into a season of winter. And I would be very worried about it and try to like push it against that by like trying to find new members, like activating members. But by now I realized that is so much pressure on yourself and it's not healthy. Really what you need to do is let that group go through that phase. And then when the energy comes back, it comes back.
Of course.
And I think also as an individual, what we often have is like as members, we have a binary idea of what a member is. You're either an active member or you're a passive, not a member. But the reality is so much more like fluid. Like you might be an active member now, and then you're not an active member, and you want to maybe like then host something. And I think one way how the cyclical can come in my opinion, is that ideally a community has every year, for example, the cycle comes to an end and you have a moment of choice. And after a year, you ask Marion, like, how would you like to be involved in the next season? Do you want to step in kind of as an active member? Do you want to be an observer on the outside? Are you on sabbatical? Do you want to just be a friend of the community for a while? Or is this something interesting you want to play a more active role? But we can't just do this once. We have to do it again with every cycle, because you will change, the group will change. And so we have to build this in. So that's kind of one example of how I think about the cyclical in the community.
I love it. And we need to honor and respect that cyclical movement, right? Because constantly, I feel that, the only thing that we have constant is change, but, we are a human species that it seems like as a species, I know that it depends on each person, but as a species, it seems like, a lot of people don't like change, right? And we keep things static and like, grasping things to stay the way they are. And there's nothing static that we have. There's night and day, there's seasons, there's a flow of water. It's like almost, there are a few things that they actually stay as they are, right? Even in like cities, for example, like Chernobyl, that a lot of people were forced to live outside of there, and now nature is going like with its full force inside, right? And we've seen all of these, like Angkor Wat over in Cambodia and many other places, right? That is going through cycles. Maybe some cycles could be in a month, and other cycles could be in 100 years. But everything is changing constantly, and sometimes we feel that we're not that comfortable with that change, right?
Absolutely. And now think about it. If you had to visualize a community, again, like the mechanical mindset is like, oh, this is like a fixed network. It's like a router here and a router here and a router here. But a community, really, if you had to like visualize it, it's like it's a living being, right? It's you can't grasp it. It's like it's here, it's there, it's moving, it's evolving. It's like a being that's constantly alive. And it is just like nature. Like it is really like just nature is not just like it's not a mechanical thing that is just there. It moves, it breathes. And I think that's exactly.
And I wanted to ask you about 4 things that I think that they are quite important in building communities. And I want to ask your opinion about this. The first one is the power of trust. The second, the power of connection. The third one, the power of vulnerability. And the fourth one, the power of intimacy.
Yeah.
How important are these 4 things inside building community? And is there a specific order between them?
Yeah. You named all the right ingredients, I think. For me, they're all actually the same thing to some extent. They're all almost different perspectives on the same thing. Maybe from one you look at it from the side, and one from the front, and one from the bottom, but it's kind of the same thing. And trust just describes what the quality of the relationship is between. Belonging and connection is just another word for relationships. Connection is kind of like the values neutral word for relationship. Trust is a strong relationship, or a kind of a trust relationship. Belonging is when relationship becomes identity. When you're like, oh, Marion, you and I, there's not just a you and I, there's a we. We are in this together. And that is incredibly powerful for us as humans. We are social beings, and we want to feel like I'm not alone. And I do think that when you come back to the story, so much in today's story is a story of aloneness, of individualism, of like, you have to like fight for yourself. And belonging is kind of the other story where it's like, no, you're part of something. You're part of something bigger. And I think as humans, we need that so deeply. It's a feeling of safety. It's a feeling of care. It's a feeling of a bigger purpose than myself, to be part of it. And then I think intimacy is also, I see is kind of in that same mixture, where how do you really have a relationship that you feel something, where you like, it's not just a transaction, but it's an emotion. So I see them all kind of in the same ball. I see them also at the very essence, at the center of a community.
Of course, those are kind of like the building bricks of what makes a relationship, right? And
exactly.
What I like about intimacy is that there's this book called The Presence Process by Michael Brown, and he says that intimacy, it's actually into me you see. Kind of like, being able to see all the way inside of me, and myself, letting you see that into me, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's funny because there's no intimacy if there's no trust, right?
Yeah.
And there's no trust if there is no belonging, right?
And you mentioned the word vulnerability, right? It's like, you have to be vulnerable to let someone see into you. Yeah.
And if you're not fostering these values, for example, in some communities nowadays, because there are some different values, some communities or networks are more about, what do you do, right? And like, tell me about your career and like stuff like that. And people will be like, oh, so I did this and I did that. And it's everything kind of like on the crust, right? You're not actually digging deep. You're not actually telling like everybody, like, how do you feel? Or like, oh, when you did this at your work, did you feel scared? Did you felt, that you were not understood? Did you felt that you were criticized? Kind of like, give me kind of like the meat,
Yeah.
Like, I don't want constantly I did this and I conquered this, which that is amazing, of course. Yeah. But sometimes like on the superhero stories, right? We're constantly seeing kind of like Superman, right? Arriving at the moment that the world needs Superman to go and like save the girl or like save the world or whatever it is that Superman saves, right? But I want to get to know the behind the scenes. Like, was Superman flying and thinking, oh my God, will I be able to save her? Oh my God, what if I fall? Oh my God, what if I screw up? Oh my God, what if actually my
cape flies off?
Exactly, my cape flies off and it's not working. What if, I want to see that behind the scenes, and that is actually that vulnerability. The moments that we don't trust ourselves, or the moments that we hesitate, the moments of doubt. And there's actually where we have the ability to make those decisions. So what can you tell us about that behind the scenes inside community, where actually the emotional network gets built?
Yeah, it's a beautiful question. I I think that, again, like, I'm playing a lot today with this like idea of like two stories, like the one of separation and the one of like connectedness and everything being connected to each other. And I think if you assume that you are totally separate from the other person, it makes sense to tell your best story. That is the smartest thing to do. You should tell your best story because you want to look strong, because you need to survive. You need to come forward. In a story where actually you, Marion, and we are actually kind of already deeply connected, the best thing I can do is show you what's really happening inside of me, so you can really connect to that. Because really, like, when we see someone's vulnerability, we feel less alone. We feel like, oh, I'm not the only one who is as fucked up as this, or I'm not the only one who has fears, or I'm not the only one, whatever it is. And that's why vulnerability is a really beautiful and true way of opening. It's who we really truly are, and to connect in that way. I do think vulnerability has also become quite trendy these days. And I have been in environments where vulnerability almost comes too fast. I find that for me personally, I feel like vulnerability has to be earned. If I don't know you, if we start talking about, if we don't know each other, and let's say the facilitator says, tell each other something very like vulnerable and open, that's not safe. That is not a smart thing, actually. It's not very safe, especially in today's environment, because true vulnerability is risky. You're opening up a wound and you're showing that wound to the other person. And I think it has to be earned over time. You need to create an environment where people feel safe, maybe where people feel brave, where people can say like, okay, yes, I'm slowly getting there to open up. And what I see in some communities is fake vulnerability, where people tell stories that are a little bit like, oh, something bad happened, but really it's also kind of like, it actually shows them in a very strong light. And that's okay, but it doesn't, again, it comes from that story of like, I want to look good. And vulnerability has become one of these like things where they're kind of trendy. Everyone has read Brené Brown, and it's like, okay, I'm going to look vulnerable, but I'm going to do it in a cool way. And unfortunately, fortunately, then it doesn't work. And so I think it just needs it needs time, it needs safety, it needs caring facilitation, it needs role modeling. I think one of the things I think about a lot in community is role modeling. When I walked into like the events you organized in Mexico City, everyone looked at you and looked at like, how were you treating people? How were you welcoming people? How were you like inviting people? And from that, they were like, this is what the vibes are in this group. You didn't have to write it down. And often I would say there's also many communities who have nice value statement and mission statements and whatnot. That's okay. That can be important. But having someone in the community who lives these and role models these values, I think is so much more powerful. And that's how we learn. That's like, I look at you and be like, all right, that's nice. I'm going to be like that too now.
It's more important the example, right? Than the words.
Yeah, to live it, not just to talk about it.
Exactly. And complementing a little bit about what you were saying about vulnerability, I think that vulnerability also, I agree with you that, it needs to be earned. And sometimes it's like just way too frontal or way too open. And I think also that vulnerability needs courage. And sometimes we don't even talk about the courage or the fear that it actually creates, being vulnerable. And it just reminded me of this amazing quote from Dan Fredingborg. Do you know it, Fabian?
From what?
This quote from Dan Fredingborg.
No.
If not, I would like to read it because I think this answer, or this quote that I'm about to read, for me, like when I heard it, it was, I don't know, maybe 5 years ago, maybe, and it hit so hard. And here it goes. So,
Yeah.
Dan Fredenberg, a Google executive who was killed during the 2015 Nepal earthquake, was asked, "What is the greatest risk you have ever taken?" And his response was, "While climbing Carsten's Pyramid, the tallest mountain in Oceania, a fellow climber fell, lost all of her blood, and nearly died of hypothermia. Had we returned on the 6-day trek through the jungle that we used on the way in, she would have certainly died. To rescue her, I smuggled her through Grasberg Mine, the largest gold mine in the world. Along the way, we risked being shot by mercenaries, had our friends kidnapped and held hostage, and then were ultimately arrested and imprisoned inside a jail inside the gold mine. And I was on Mount Everest this year when an ice serac fell into the icefall and killed all but my team on the mountain. Afterwards, we executed body recovery and then climbed back down through the damaged route. But these were mostly calculated risks. If I had to select the greatest risk I've ever taken in my life, it has been to throw myself into a romantic relationship with someone to reach a point of deep, illogical, and visceral love, to a point where emotion and human connection overpowers any reason and safety. To be vulnerable psychologically and emotionally. This is real risk with the greatest reward."
Yeah, it's beautiful. Yeah, it's beautiful. I think it's also, I think our society does not look at opening up and speaking about things as real, that risky, I think, or it's a different kind of bravery. It's also often, I think there's also a gender stereotype associated with it, where it's like, for females, that's easier to do, and for men, that's like maybe harder to do, but it's not there's some kind of like stereotyping there, which is, which, I don't know, it doesn't reward it. It doesn't it's actually, I think, for example, there are like a lot of, a female type of intelligence with these kind of things, but it's real courage that's behind that. And I do think a question that I don't know the answer to, but that you brought up for me now is like, how can I increase that courage in the communities I work with? Like, what's a way to create an environment of courage? And my intuition is there is no short, easy way to do it. I think humans are messy, humans are slow, we change very incrementally. We don't change with big steps, and I think the same thing happens in community. And so, yeah, I guess I'm just rambling here, like with a question, but it's a beautiful quote. It really gets me thinking about courage.
When I think about the question that you just raised, I think, when you watch someone being courageous in whatever thing that person is going through in her or his life, I think that inspires a lot, right? And if you are maybe in a community and you bring up the conversation about courage, and you open the conversation about in which time in your life maybe have you had fear, and with that earned trust, and with that earned vulnerability, I think listening to other people's stories can actually help you ponder, reflect about where do you stand with your own courage, right? And the other day I read this quote that said that the point of being alive, just by your mere existence, it reflects that you have a lot of courage, because you're constantly using courage to live better, to try to live better, right?
Yeah, I think that's really true. And I think in the context of community, I think we talk about holding space is one of these words that's been quite used, is quite trendy, is being used a lot these days, like hold space for each other. And I do think that is real skill that is so crucial, because I think if someone is being really courageous and open and vulnerable, but if the space is not being held for that, it can be really damaging and possibly traumatizing experience. And I think our responsibility also as community weavers is to either us or find the people to really hold space for these things. And some communities do not have the capacity to hold space for those kind of conversations. They don't have the muscle for it. And I think to recognize that, and then maybe to bring in outside hosts, and because there are people who are really good at that, but it's a very unique skill. And I think there's in some communities I see that they take that too easily, and then people step forward into courage, and that is a gift that they're giving you, and you have to be really careful with that gift.
100%. And I can't wait to ask you, by listening to you and all of these, knowledge, you co-created the Community Canvas, right? And I love this Community Canvas because I think it's kind of like a step-by-step guide that it guides you through how you can build a meaningful community, and a community that connects, right? Not a network, but a community. And honestly, I love your work on this. I want to ask you how it is designed, and how was the process behind designing it?
It's interesting because we're actually now working on a new version of a framework, and so we are deeply in that process right now. Part of it has been just interviewing community builders and asking them, like, for actually the question that we are having at the center for this version is, what makes a community healthy? What makes a community thrive? So not just what makes a community, but what makes a community healthy? What makes a community flourish? What makes a community thrive? And so part of it has been like primary research by talking to people. Parts of it has been secondary research, reading deeper into these topics. And also we've been, over the last 2-3 years, we've been running these learning journeys where we take people who run communities, usually like a group of like 20 people or so, and we take them over 10 sessions where we go through a framework, and we've learned a lot from hosting that and from the people in there. And there are certain struggles, certain patterns that we see that a lot of people struggle with. And some of these patterns are around, a lot of people feel like, oh, what I do with my passive people? I have all these passive people. How do I engage them? People struggle with conflict. Conflict is there. What do we do about it? There's often questions around money, like how do we resource ourselves? So there are certain patterns and questions that are starting to emerge, which in the first version of the community, we didn't have such a strong opinion maybe yet, what is good and what is bad. And now I think we're starting to have more of an opinion. And we're hoping to, in the next like 3-4 months, have something to share with the world about that.
Amazing. Please let us know when you release it. We would like to be there in the front line watching this new version. And I wanted to ask you about diversity, because in most of the communities that I've been or that I've seen, close to me, it could be, Sandbox, Summit, Reality, Hatch, Global Shapers, and so on. Yes, of course, you have that diversity in the sense of people from different backgrounds, or gender, or skin color, or religion, or you have that. But in the end, I've seen that in those communities, you find kind of like people like you, right? So how can you foster community building with like groups of people that show a lot of diversity? Because, for example, Sandbox, no, it's also kind of like people similar to you, Summit as well, right? And even though Sandbox and Summit and other networks are, I don't know how many countries around the world, but maybe 140 countries around the world, maybe. And at the end, you kind of like have this sense of there's people similar to you. But how would you foster a community where you have different diversity of backgrounds and like more richness in the diversity?
Yeah, I think about that question a lot, and I don't actually have a good answer to it. What I've learned is that most communities want diversity, but most communities don't actually have the capabilities to, again, similar to like the vulnerability before. Most communities want diversity, but I think truly to have diversity, you need to be able to hold conversations and hold diversion of thoughts, true diversion of thoughts. And I think we're also talking about, if you want to build truly diverse communities, I think we have to be willing to invite questions of colonialism, racism, collective trauma into the center of the conversation. If you truly want that, if we want people who have been traditionally oppressed to be part of the community, which is really what, like, we're not talking about like that we need to have more white people, more white males in these communities. It's often about how to bring more people of color, people from the global south, people from less privileged backgrounds. And my sense is that most of these groups say they want this, but I feel like, and I'm in the same boat. I feel like I don't actually have the muscle, the understanding to then really truly host these kind of conversations and to work through that. That's one thing. I think true diversity ideally starts at the very center of the community. Like, who are the founders? Who are the initiators? Sandbox was started by like a bunch of white German-speaking guys, right? Like, that is in the center of the DNA, still a little bit to some extent today, and you probably will never be able to fully get away from that. It's beautiful now, for example, Netra, who's running Sandbox, that she is beyond that, and I would love to ask her like how she reflects back on that. But I think that it's very hard to change the DNA later on, and I personally don't think that simply adding on diversity later on by like inviting some people from a more diverse group works. I think it has to be a super intentional process. It has to be at the core. It has to, and you have to be willing to face some really difficult conversations. So yeah, that's kind of one of the learning edges for me. And I've been in communities where there were some amazing facilitators, amazing community weavers, and we were not able to hold true conversations around diversity. Because it's like, okay, let's talk about racism. Okay, let's talk about colonialism. Okay, let's talk about like privilege and like why some of these people here in the room have a lot of money and why others have not. Like, where is that coming from? Or let's talk about like, cultural genocide of indigenous people. How, and then like, reconcile and heal that and come to a place of healing and truth and acceptance. That's next level. And it's definitely, it feels like something I want to learn, but I don't feel like I'm actually able to truly hold. There are some practitioners who are good at this, but I think they're very few. Yeah.
Also, because diversity, doing those exercises around diversity, right? About racism and about, kind of like getting that connection between people from different backgrounds and different opportunities, it actually creates this empathy and this compassion between groups. So I think that's one of the most important, values. Of course, diversity has many values, but I think creating compassion and empathy through different groups of people actually creates even more this human connection, because you understand. And you've seen all of these kind of like social projects. I don't know if you've seen them, but there was one that they went into a public school in the States, and they put everybody like, starting at the same line, and they asked like, if you've been verbally abused by your parents, take a step. Well, no, it was actually the other way around. It was they did one in jail that every time that that the inmates were like abused their childs or beaten up by someone in their community and so on, they would step a step forward, and you could see the difference of most of them were actually having very difficult childhoods. And the other one that I was mentioning you about the school it was like, did you had your parents that they didn't get divorced? Take a step. You were born white. Take a step. You were born in a place where you have, I don't know, economic,
opportunities.
Security, yeah, take a step. And then you saw the difference between someone that didn't have opportunities and the other one before they were reaching, the goal. And of course, the opportunities were like, so it's ridiculous, that we're, in a world where not everybody has the same opportunities, and it's really important to create that empathy. Around privilege and around racism, around many things that we have in our society that are also impacting the networks and the communities that we are involved with, right?
Yeah, well said. And I think Sandbox is quite an empathetic community in some extent, and yet true conversations about racism, or true conversations about colonialism, or true conversations about systemic inequality or privilege or whatnot, I think they only happen maybe on the fringes, and I think I used to think I still want to build really diverse communities, and I think it's kind of similar to the vulnerability thing. For a quote unquote, for a diverse person to become part of these communities is actually really risky sometimes. And because I don't know, to then talk about racism, they have to share their story. They get maybe re-traumatized by it. They have to make a point. If we truly talk about racism, it's super personal. Everyone gets triggered by it. And again, I'm not saying this to say that this is not important, but I'm saying that this is like the skills we need to develop in the 21st century, is like, how can we hold spaces to have these conversations in a healing way, in a generative way. And I think most groups just don't have that. And in the absence of that, if you just invite, some people of color to your event or your communities, it's just so it looks more diverse, I think you're doing sometimes more a disservice to these, or I think it can be honestly quite, it feels kind of colonial to some extent sometimes for me. So yeah, you can see I'm clearly don't know exactly how to deal with this, but I feel very strongly that it's something to learn about and to go deeper into.
Totally. And I would love to talk a little bit about the Horsey Manifesto, which I love. Yeah. And we'll read it for the people who are listening to this and they haven't.
The whole thing?
The whole thing. It will be fast.
All right. Okay. All right.
And if you could tell us a little bit about how did you arrive to this? Was it something that you knew all the way and you just put it down? Was it something that you discovered as you were growing up? Was it something that you had kind of like, when lightning strike, what was it? So I'm going to read it. This is your life.
Before you read it, before you read, I'll give a little bit of context so people know. I think it might make sense. And I might flush and feel slightly embarrassed when you read it, because I don't know. I don't know quite why, but here's the background story. So I created an organization together with two close friends. They're called Dave and Mike Ropovar. They're two brothers. And the intention was to create a values-driven organization, a startup that would create products that would help people to lead more meaningful lives. And at the beginning, we felt like we wanted to define what success would be like, not by the money, by the traditional form of like how you define a startup success, but through the life that we wanted to live. And that's what the manifesto became. And I remember that the manifesto kind of came together quite spontaneously. I also remember that one of the three, like Dave, he was really like the main person who was like, oh, I have an idea. And he just wrote something down and shared it with us. And maybe we added something. That's how I remember, but it came together very quickly. And then it was on our website just as a text for quite a while. And people didn't really read it, but it was nothing much happened. And then at some point, someone in our ecosystem, the Horsey ecosystem, offered to design it the way it's designed now. And then it started to spread quite a bit online. And that's kind of when it became more than it is.
Started to spread like fire, right? Because it's been shared more than 120 million times.
It's been shared a lot, yeah. There's even people who have tattooed it onto their bodies.
It's beautiful. So here it goes. This is your life. Do what you love and do it often. If you don't like something, change it. If you don't like your job, quit. If you don't have enough time, stop watching TV. If you're looking for the love of your life, stop. They will be waiting for you when you start doing things you love. Stop overanalyzing. All emotions, life is simple. All emotions are beautiful when you eat. Appreciate every last bite. Open your mind, arms, and heart to new things and people. We are united in our differences. Ask the next person you see what their passion is and share your inspiring dream with them. Travel often. Getting lost will help you find yourself. Some opportunities only come once. Seize them. Life is about the people you meet and the things you create with them. So go out and start creating. Live your dream and share your passion. Life is short.
Yeah.
Love it. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. And I've seen that, there's like many things online that have retweeted it, that have it in their webpage, that you can buy it and so on. So congratulations on sharing this piece of knowledge that it seems that, it gave a lot of value to many people. So thank you for sharing the knowledge.
Yeah, thanks for sharing it. It's that's now 14 years ago or something like that. It's a while back, and I think it felt right for that time. Like we were in our 20s, we were young, excited single man in New York City, and wanting to live that lifestyle. I'm not sure if I would write it the same again. Like, life is about the people you meet and the things you create with them. Absolutely, I think that's still at the very center for me. But I think it was the right thing for that time.
Maybe you can also do the new version of the Horsey Manifesto, like having the manifesto updated every decade of your life, in your 20s, on your 30s, on your 40s.
Yeah, maybe. It can be a strange experience if you put a lot of emotion and values into, let's say, a document. If that goes really viral, it's kind of strange. It's kind of strange because it's like, it led almost a little bit, for me personally, almost a little bit like so many people saw it and connected with it that it almost, there was a gap between me and it. Then at some point, it almost became other people's manifesto to some extent. I stopped reading it. I stopped looking at it like my own philosophy, because it became so kind of popular in some form. It became like other people's, and that's an interesting observation, because it's like, okay, like I feel like these values thing, and these days it's become very popular that organizations have values and manifestos. It's like an advertising thing. It's like a marketing thing. But if you truly believe in those values, it's very personal. It's very personal, and I think not, and to have them like, don't know. I don't quite know where I'm going with this, but it was an interesting experience.
And I think it shows authenticity. This manifesto shows authenticity, and it can be on other manifestos from other brands that sometimes it could be just because of marketing or just because of brand positioning. I don't know, but this one kind of like felt that was written from the heart. And that's big. I
know, but here's the thing: like authenticity, if it feels authentic, is one thing, but true authenticity is if you then end up, if I, who am like, help like create it, like really live that way. And the living it is always much harder than the saying it, and that's where true authenticity, I think, comes from. And I don't think we were inauthentic. I do think that was our lifestyle. I don't know. I think now for me, it's become more important to, I don't know if I will share my personal next manifesto with the world. I think it's something just for me.
Yeah. Privacy, of course. And I think that real authenticity sometimes comes from thinking, doing, and being with coherence.
Exactly. And the being part is the hardest part.
Of course. That is actually we are completely accountable for.
Yeah, exactly. And then you know it where you're faking it or where you're real.
Totally. Hi, Fabian. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing your magic, your knowledge, your experience with LUAN. And I would like to close by asking you a few questions. Ideally, if you can answer with one or a few words, just kind of like try to keep it short. There's no right or wrong answer. Just kind of like response whatever comes to your heart first. But
Cool. Great.
what is art for you?
Life.
Your favorite author?
Right now, Charles Eisenstein.
An advice that changed your life?
Never confuse someone's outside with your inside.
The best quality in humans?
Generosity.
A book that you recommend?
Impact Networks by David Ehrlichman.
Nice. Create connections by collaboration. Love it. What feeds your soul?
Good food.
The most pressing issue for humanity?
Relationships.
If humans can agree on this, you will be very happy.
I don't know. Chill out.
What would you like to scream to the whole world?
Chill out.
Something that you expect with joy in 2022.
I didn't hear it. Say it one more time.
Something that you expect with joy in 2022.
Summer.
The last one. What is it that you have lived that no one could miss experiencing it?
Say it one more time.
What is it that you have lived that no one could miss experiencing it?
That I would recommend other people to experience it. Hiking.
Hiking. Yeah.
Hiking.
I love it. I love it. Amazing, Fabian. Well, thank you. It was a pleasure to have you here in LUAN Podcast. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, your magic, everything that you've seen in your long career about community building. And thank you so much for sharing it with us. So thank you so much for all of your magic.
Thank you, Mariam, for having me.
It's my pleasure. Want to keep the conversation going? LUAN, the world's first emotional museum, designed a global online experience to inspire and explore. Follow us on Instagram, YouTube, Telegram, and visit our site at luanmuseum.com to engage creatively.